area where a body will give a data set to a faculty member or to a department and have specific controls that need to go with that data. And so really we're seeing a lot of compliance issues come back, making sure that we are maintaining the proper protection of that data. Also for risk analysis and mitigation, we're really getting into an area where we don't really know where a lot of this data is. Throughout the recent years with our PCI compliance program and some with our 8019 authorization to hold Social Security numbers through the Privacy Office, we've been able to get some control of the data, but however, a lot of the other data, we really don't have an idea where it's at and if it's properly being protected. So to do some proper risk analysis, we need to figure out where this data is at. And finally, fundamental security. Really, because of the distributed and diverse nature of Penn State, we know that there's data almost everywhere. So really trying to get a grasp of where that data is at and to make sure that the right data is being properly protected. So a question, and Adobe Connect could be another show of hands. Do you remember when data categorization was first introduced? Kathy, 4 years ago, 3 years ago, we put it. There was a wiki space up. It was previously called data classification. Wiki. Yeah, Kathy began pioneering it in 1994, but we had a wiki space up with a request for comments 2008, several years ago. Show of hands, anybody remember that? Some people remember it. What stood out the most about that, of those people who saw it? Okay, we have one person who says it was complicated. Yeah, well, and there's still some complicating factors around that. And really, when you think about that wiki space, that was a combination of the classification and the security controls that went with that. For this project, we're just really pulling out the data classification portions and worrying about that. The minimum security baseline, which is what the security controls, they previously called security controls, now it's minimum security baseline. That's actually in front of the IT Leadership Council as we speak, and they're reviewing that. Anybody else, anything that stood out for them? Nobody? It's actually surprising because when we talk, for security, when we talk to a lot of people, they bring up this document and certain pain points with that document. So this is the second time we've asked this question and really haven't gotten too much response back. So it's good. We're moving on. Some of the timeline and scope, and we're actually starting to assign some timelines to this. So we're currently just finishing up a pilot with Digital Library Technologies. But our hope is next month to have a unit liaison assigned for data categorization, and this is going to be a group of people. I'll go a little bit more into it later, but a kind of an administrative, somebody who's somewhat technical but can have the ear of a dean or a director, a technical person, kind of a boots on the ground type of person, and a financial person who can have an idea of what needs to be spent. Will be signed as unit liaisons. This letter will go out to a budget executive and have them choose a unit liaison. We're going to have lots of information to help them choose the right person. And we hope that that letter can actually go out next month, and we would give about a month to allow that, that liaison to be suggested. Question? Oh, I have a question in the back, just getting the mic to them.
I mean, when you talk about unit liaison, how big are you defining your unit? An entire academic unit, or just smaller departmental level?
Right. Really, the definition is we're looking at like colleges and campuses and things like that. Obviously, large units like ITS that have many entities in them, we can imagine there being a liaison in TNS, in consultants. Things like that. A large organization like finance and business would also be broken down into smaller parts. Really, where the lines make sense, we think that this is probably going to be a technical person, so really where those lines make sense for that. And then next, after we introduce that unit liaison, is training. We're going to have lots of training opportunities, both on data categorization and stuff within Penn State policies, but also in security in general, and I'll go into that. And then in October is when we'll start actually doing some of the data inventory. And really what we're looking at starting is some of the high-risk units, get this started, and then move on outwards into other units. And really, this will probably touch every unit that is a Penn State, but we're really going to start with some of the higher risk units. And then as we start to get into phase 2, we'll begin to look at things like the security controls and the minimum security baseline. And then finally in phase 3, as I said, a multi-year, multi-phase program, we'll be talking about attesting to some compliance. We know we have HIPAA, FERPA requirements, PCI requirements. So through this, we'll get some compliance attestation. And then finally into some asset management and risk levels where we'll actually be able to have some tools for executives to look at and make proper risk decisions for the university. So some of the training opportunities, we're going to have several opportunities for training, both for data categorization and also for security awareness. Orientation will be for before the liaisons, and this is really where we'll go over stuff specific to data categorization, kind of the role of the liaison, how they'll perform it. Also, we'll have some pretty in-depth modular training for the boots on the ground security liaisons. They're not going to have to go very deep into modulo, but they'll at least have to be able to get into the interface, be able to send out surveys and analyze some results. So we'll have training available for that. The third thing is called TEACS training. It's actually put out by Texas A&M. And it's really good training, and it is free, which is really good as well. And we're currently working with them through ITS Training Services to get Penn State authentication introduced into that product. And I'll have some information about that in a little bit. And that'll be security training that's aimed directly at the technical person. It'll have security and risk management training to go with that. And then finally, we have an overarching goal of having security awareness training for all employees at Penn State. So we're currently working with the University of Arizona, who has a training program in place for security awareness. The state of Arizona actually requires this to happen, so we actually have permission to use some of their materials, so we're working on that as well, and that'll be another training opportunity. Here's a screenshot of actually a qualifying exam of the TEACS training, and this was done by Texas A&M. I think it was a grant from FEMA, so there's a lot of Homeland Security type stuff in it. The one thing you have to watch, we were having some people test it for us, and one of the questions asked about, I think, experience with weapons of mass destruction, which kind of threw some people off. But the training itself, is very good security and risk management wise. There will be pre-tests that will, if you get a certain grade on that, you won't actually have to go through the whole test. There is a range depending on the classes, anywhere from 13 hours to 18 hours, depending on that. We're actually working on putting together a focus group for the TEACS training to have people to go through some of the training, give us some feedback. We want to be able to collect some metrics, like how long it takes people to do these courses. We really would like to get an idea of how many people might test out of it. We expect and hope that a lot of people will test out of it where they won't have to go through the whole process. However, we want to try to collect some of those metrics and give the units as much information as we can to be sure that they're committing the right amount of time to that. So if you're interested in being in the TEACS training focus group to help us out with that, you can just drop us a line and we'll have our contact information at the end of the talk. So to get a little bit into modulo, and Jen will actually have modulo up and bring up one of the surveys. But basically, we'll have 3 types of phases in the modulo project for GRC. The first type is really about the data types, and we're really focusing in on the user. So as Jen will show with some of the questions, we're really worried about the user and what data they store. As I said earlier, when we move into the next phase, we'll actually be looking at the security controls and the minimum security baseline, and that'll actually focus on the device, which will finally get us to asset management once we know where the data is at that the person's using and what device that it's on. So the project approach, as I mentioned, it's been about 3-4 months for our pilot with Digital Library Technologies. We selected them because they have a unique situation where they have some technical people within DLT, but they also, because they support the university libraries, we also have some non-technical people there. And just a few weeks ago, we had the first survey go out to a non-technical person. So we've had a really good pilot with them. Really where we thought we were going to go with this when we started 5 or 6 months ago is probably drastically different from this pilot. So we did learn a lot from this, and it's actually been a great experience for us to gather this information. So we did a lot of things. We had many different surveys that we sent out trying to get the right ratio. As we said a couple weeks ago, there was the first time that the surveys went out to a non-technical audience. So we identified a lot of places where we had some technical terms that the basic user didn't understand. So we really worked hard at honing those processes down on the survey. The other thing we wanted to do was gather metrics, because we know that this is going to be a time-taking experience. It's going to take a lot of time and effort across Penn State. We wanted to gather a lot of those metrics of how long is this going to take, what's it going to entail. So we've gathered some of those. As we move on, that's why we're starting out with a phased rollout. We want to gather some more of those metrics to make sure that we give the right information to the people who need it to know how long it's going to take to do this. And then also, through that, assessing the rollout. In the first phase, we're really going to be focusing on staff computers because they have a lot of the administrative data. We know researchers and research data really has a different life cycle. When you think about an SSN that comes into Penn State, it will come in as an SSN and restricted and leave, hopefully through your identity finder scans. When you delete them, it will leave as an SSN. However, for research data, depending on where it's at in the life cycle, it could be highly restricted where a researcher doesn't want that to get out because they want to publish it and get grant money, but it also could be public because the grant might require it to be shared, or it might be published, so then it becomes public. So we really used the pilot to assess that, and they're going to stick with staff to start out. And really all that really went into the feasibility of the project. So some considerations, and as I mentioned several times, one of the things we wanted to consider and give a lot of thought to is the percentage of time required for this. Some estimates have been as high as 20%. We're still trying to really tack that down. The focus group for the TEACs will help us get an idea of whether or not the hours required for the training are really, are really there, because we know with some previous training that says it takes 8 hours, it might take some people 2, or it might take some people 16. Right, yeah, and Jen reminded me to say that TEACs training is for the unit liaison and not every individual that's out there. So really, we're collecting metrics on the percentage of time required to do this process. Data stewardship responsibility, we've actually been working closely with identity services to think about data stewardship, because when you think about a data owner and who is kind of in control of data, a lot of times it instantly goes back to administrative information systems, AIS. And really one of the examples I think of is with campus maps that have electrical line information or steam line information on them. Typically OPP would be the data steward of them. They probably might not even touch AIS systems, so we really got to rethink how we look at data stewardship and who's responsible for that. And AD 23 is up for the data stewardship policy is looking at being rebuilt, and we're working with Identity Services to really figure out and redefine what data stewardship really means. The minimum security baseline, as I said, that's in front of the ITLC as we speak. Hopefully in August that'll come up again for consideration. A lot of the members of ITLC have looked at that and commented on it, and we're continuously honing that as we move on. The distribution of survey, as I said, we're going to start out phased. When we thought about who this would really go out to, there really wasn't a group of employees that we could think about that wouldn't get this survey. So this survey will eventually go out to all Penn State employees. And then finally, respondent reaction. We know the past few years we've been under a lot of surveys, a lot of questioning, a lot of required training and things like that. So we're really working hard to make sure that we have a lot of questions answered. We have a website up that's going to have FAQs. We're going to have training for the liaisons to answer these questions. So we're very aware that a lot of people are, out surveyed and out questioned now, but we're going to work really hard to get all the liaisons the information that they need. So with that, are there any questions on my part as I pass it over to Jen?
I guess one question. You're identifying the liaisons, but the survey is getting distributed centrally?
Now, the first step is actually identifying the liaisons, and then the liaisons through the training program will then distribute the survey for the people that they have access over.
Okay.
And Jen will go over some of it in modulo, but all those assets will be split up to be able to, you'll have access to the people that are in your area to send it out.
Michelle asked, have you started talking to the offices that own the data, like the budget office or the registrar? Are they listed as data stewards for their data?
I believe that they're listed for the as data stewards. This actually just kicked off the project for the data stewards. We're just talking with Identity Services about that to put a position paper to get an executive sponsor for it. So we haven't went around and talked directly to the data stewards, but they'll obviously be a big part of this process moving forward.
And we are happy to actually talk to any group that is interested in learning more about this process. If you want us to come and talk to your department directly, we'd be happy to do that. We've already spoken to other individual departments and like the financial officers, the records management committee, and the ITLC is aware of this effort. So if you know of others who want us to speak to them, we'd be happy to do so. We did choose Modulo Risk Manager, which is a governance, risk, and compliance tool to manage the surveys that we'll be running with the data categorization program. As Ed had mentioned, there's two types of surveys that we anticipate on sending out. The one will have to do with the person directly and the data that they're storing. And then the other survey will be more about the technology of where the data is stored and those minimum security baselines that are applied to the technology. This is the foundational design that we have within Modulo. It consists of perimeters and assets, and an asset can be identified as a person, technology, process, or an environment. A lot of what we're doing within Modulo has to do with processes. And when you think about a process with 8019 authorizations, that's a process that we have here at the university to control who's storing Social Security numbers, right? And then another process that we're running is data categorization. So that's basically the type of assets that we're working within Risk Manager. We do have the ability to measure risk at the college or departmental level or at the university level. So there's a lot of reporting options and features that we have that are available within Modulo. This will be very nice for unit liaisons to run a report against the possibilities or the amount of restricted data that their individual unit is using and storing. You can also run reports against the risk that your department's at with respect to the devices and if it's meeting the minimum security baseline. Any questions about the foundation? Okay. I'm going to take you into an online demonstration of the survey that we have through Modulo Risk Manager. We do understand this is a little difficult to read because of the blue font. That is one of the changes that we will be making. We'll be changing it over to black font. And basically, each individual employee will receive a unique link through their email that will contain a link to the survey. And the survey is comprised of 3 different pages. And it will ask a series of questions, just some background information about who you are, what department you work in. And it'll also go into the details about the categories of data. So we have public, internal controlled, and restricted data. And depending on how you answer, whether you're storing public data, restricted data, or internal controlled data, it'll come up with another series of questions beyond that, which will pretty much pinpoint each individual data type that's within ADG07. There are 6 answer choices that are available. If you would select that you are storing restricted data, as you see, we have a rule set that's available that will bring up each one of those data types. Oops. And we'll just take the first one as an example. Do you store access control system data? And then these 6 answer selections, you may have multiple areas where you're storing this data. We do want to know if you're storing it locally or through a hosted service. If you're using Box or you're using some sort of cloud service, we want to know where you're storing that data. This is only pertaining to the data that you're storing, not that data that you're actually referencing. So if you're just referencing data, and let's say you're using directory information, you're just referencing the Penn State directory, you're not storing that data, so you would answer no for that particular question. If you are storing it, we want to know where you're storing it. And some of the rule sets that we have on here with the questions will require you to add in a comment. So we know a little bit more about the application, let's say, that you're using to store that information. We do understand for the general user, this may be difficult to identify. General users might not know what the application name is, so we are looking towards the respective IT individuals who's working with that unit liaison team to help answer some of these questions. So we do expect there will be some concerns with this. We do hope to have a lot of frequently asked questions developed around this, so there are the questions that come up, we are able to address those. Okay. And then the second page consists of internal and restricted data. Here again, you'll just see the first question that's maybe. You might have, yeah.
As Jen gets that going, one of the questions we get a lot, especially from a technical audience, is this about, like, if I'm a sysadmin and I have access that I, administer or maintain systems that have this type of data, would I have to fill this out as storing that? And the answer is no. We're really looking at what you use in your day-to-day function. So if you're a sysadmin, the likelihood is, depending upon what department you're in, you could have any type of data that we have up there, but we're really focused on what you store and what you use from a day-to-day standpoint.
Thank you. So it's very important that the users, the end users, and the respondents taking the survey are very familiar with ADG07 and AD71 with the policies. Otherwise, they may look at the question and wonder, what exactly does internal control data mean? They're not going to know and be familiar with those data types. So it's important to encourage the staff to become familiar with those policies. And all of this will be available within the message that goes out along with the survey, as well as it's on the survey itself with the details and the description of how to complete the survey. And the third page consists of pretty much the same question, but it's related to public data. Any questions about the survey? Michael.
Thanks. How will you know or determine that? Oh, good.
How will you know or determine that the answers, the responses to the survey are accurate?
We do expect the unit liaison may have a little bit of work to do by going into Modulo Risk Manager and looking at the data results. So they can run information and reports to see what the answers are. And if it looks like something that they might be storing, but they're indicating they're not storing that data, we would expect them to go back to that respondent to ask some questions. We're hoping that these questions are answered honestly, and we also hope that if there's any question from the respondent about what the data type means, that they're going to go back to their unit liaison. Any other questions? No questions online? Okay. So we'll move back into the presentation. So if we move on to the second phase, which is a minimum security baseline, we also have a secondary survey that's available. And this will collect more information about the technology and the devices itself. It's not looking at the people like the first survey will. This is more about the technology. And based on how you answer the questions with respect to the data that's on that machine, whether it's restricted data, internal controlled, or public, it'll come up with a subset of requirements that are required according to that data type. Okay? We also want to know the function of the machine so we have a better understanding. We understand that some of the minimum security baselines might not be applicable for, let's say, professionally server-based machines versus an individual desktop. So there might be a difference with those controls. In some cases, you may need to request a compensating control, in which case we are open for those. You would have to make a special request, send a notice to datacat@psu.edu to make that request, and then I think a combination between risk management and security will take a look at that control to see if it's something that we want to accept or reject. Part of our Modulo Risk Manager also allows us to go in and do an evaluation of the remediation efforts and the minimum security baseline. So this is an example of the page that you would see according to how the responses come in with those electronic devices. At this point, you would want to make a risk-based decision whether you want to accept that risk if that control is not currently in place, or if you want to send it over to treatment. If you're willing to accept it, it is something that we do have on file. If anything would happen, then we're able to go back and trace those steps that were taken and those risk-based decisions that were made. Some of these, as you see, you are able to accept those. Others you can send over to a treatment stage. And then the last feature that Modulo Risk Manager allows is a workflow functionality. It allows you to indicate who you want to start working on those remediation efforts. You can have your unit liaison, you can have your information technology staff. Let's say you've got a couple different groups within your administrative areas. There's different departments in some of these larger administrative areas, so you might not need to assign other individuals. So you can assign a deadline for that particular control to become remediated, depending on the risk level of that control. If it's something at higher risk, let's say you've got a lot of restricted data on a particular machine, and you've got a lot of counts of that PII, you might want to remediate those efforts a little sooner than later. So this allows you to really get those folks involved who need to be involved. At this point, they would need to go into Modulo Risk Manager to enter this information in. And one point that I didn't make, whenever we send the survey out to the respondent, they will not have to actually log into Modulo Risk Manager. That survey will come up as a web form. So they'll never have to go into the system itself. They'll be able to just complete that web form. So training won't be applicable to everybody. It's more applicable to those unit liaisons and those people who are using the functionality of Modulo. It also allows us to restrict who has access to this information and the information that they're entering into it. So we wouldn't want somebody working on the remediation efforts to be able to change the deadlines. That would be more up to the unit liaison to set that deadline, and whoever's responsible for the remediation efforts could simply go in and make comments about the progress that's being made. And if they need more time, this is the place where they would be able to go in and comment whether they need to extend the deadline or if they want to request a compensating control because something isn't really working appropriately, or maybe they don't have the proper funding available at the time. They want to consider this in strategic planning. Those sort of things would be made in the comment section. Okay. We do have a question from Adobe Connect that we're going to read off.
Okay. It says, a few slides ago, it sounded like there would be surveys completed regarding devices, assets, and the minimum security baseline. Is it expected that a survey be completed for each device asset that a person has access to? For example, in a research lab, a person may work on 10 plus computers. Does that mean a survey for each computer?
We have not worked all those details out yet, but I think it will be dependent on whether those surveys are configured, or the servers are configured the same, or the desktops, if they have the same configuration. It'll be very dependent on those details.
Yeah, and we're obviously aware, especially in the research area, that a lot of labs have a lot of machines that may or may not have this type of data on it. And we're really looking at ways, especially as places get enterprise management of their machines, there might be some ways that we can shortcut this based on how those machines are configured. So really, it's stuff we're looking at now, and that phase is a little bit down the road.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Good question back.
So I'm curious, how does network configuration data apply here from a standpoint? I mean, is it restricted? Is it internally controlled? You know, router configurations, switch configurations, and things like that.
Yeah, that type of data is generally restricted, depending on the level of details that you have, along with those diagrams. And you can find all the data types that are listed in ADG07. There's a full listing. And each listing of the data type in ADG07 will be included in the survey. Here again, it is rule-based on those questions that are asked, those initial data category questions. So if you say that you're not storing restricted data, you won't see that subset of data type questions that will be presented. If anybody does take a look at the policy and you see other data types that should be listed there, please send us an email and let us know. We try to capture as many data types as possible. As Kathy mentioned, this has been a work in progress for some time now. We've met with multiple groups to find out what data types were available at the university, what people were storing, and that sort of thing. So we think we have a pretty comprehensive list, but there's bound to be some that we're missing.
Yeah, and keep in mind, especially with as distributed as we are, that we understand that it's hard to put up a policy or a guideline and have that apply totally across. So as Jen mentioned, there'll be opportunities for compensating controls, and you know, those will be reviewed as necessary. So you know, a lot of this stuff is generic specifically because if we get any more specific, you know, it really won't, you know, it won't work out for the units, because we know that different people do different things with data. Especially coming from TNS, there might be reasons to share some of those configurations or something like that. So we understand that there will be needs for compensating controls or exceptions for that.
And we do have a list of frequently asked questions that we're building for the minimum security baseline as well. So you can expect to see those hopefully within a couple months or so. As Ed had mentioned earlier, that is under review by the ITLC and some of their staff. So hopefully we'll be able to get approval to put that into either a policy or some sort of guideline based off of AD71. Any other questions? Okay, so at this point, what's coming up in the future? We're going to continue with the pilot. We do have about 2 weeks left with the pilot that we're currently going through, and that's only reaching for the first phase of this process. So it's only reaching the survey that's going to go to each individual employee, collecting information about the data that they're storing. We're going to start a second pilot based on the minimum security baseline once they're approved. Initially, we were going to include both of those processes in with the same pilot, but considering that they're truly two different processes, we don't have those into approval, and they're not in a policy format yet, so we decided to break those up into two separate ones. We have not decided yet who we're going to pilot the second phase of this project yet. If this is something you feel that your unit would be interested in, please let us know. As Ed mentioned, we do have our contact information at the end, and we'd be happy to hear from you and have other piloteers, so to speak, to go through this process. And we expect maybe in a couple months or so that second phase pilot will begin. We are making some survey adjustments. Initially, we started out with 2 different survey types. One that was covering each data type in general, so it truly listed data types that fell under restricted data and the public and the internal controlled. And there were about 74 questions that each individual employee would have to go through and say yes or no to. We then went to a second survey that matched and said, you know, are you simply storing restricted data? And that was the end of that. Are you storing public data? And that was it. We were only collecting metrics on 3 data types. But then we didn't have enough detail in those collections of responses that we could really analyze what type of data they were storing. Because as you know, there are compliance restrictions and obligations that we have to follow. So if somebody indicates that they're simply storing restricted data, it's not really telling us what type of restricted data that they're storing. So that's when we came up with the combined survey that we now have and expect to go with, where you see the main category questions, and based on how you answer those, it'll give you another selection of data type questions beyond that. We do continue to update our website. It's datacat@psu.edu. If you'd like to go out and take a look, we do have a set of frequently asked questions available there. At the very end of this pilot, we do expect to have some recommended rollout practices that departments and unit liaisons can use as far as informing their staff, how they can get others involved in addressing the questions that are coming in. We are planning an awareness campaign with ITS Communication Services, where we're going to have a mass mailing go out to all staff sometime in the fall. And we're going to also ask for volunteers with the high-risk areas. Rather than roll this out to the entire university, we figured we would subsection some of the rollout process for this. So if you are interested here again in even being a pilot, or not a pilot, rather, but a volunteer unit before we roll it out to the entire university, we're interested in hearing from you. Otherwise, we'll be rolling it out to those high-risk areas. And we will continue with the training analysis for the TEACS training, making sure that all of these areas apply, making sure that this is a really good fit for the unit liaisons and their staff, and also developing those security trainings for the rest of the general audience. We are benchmarking with a couple other universities who have a data categorization process in place, so we're learning a lot from them as well. They're taking a different, a different focus on this. So some people are just reaching out and looking at the electronic devices rather than what the data is being stored by each individual employee. So it's kind of a learning, give and take process that we're going through with these other institutions that we're working with. So some of the action items that all of you can take back, you can certainly speak to others about the concept of what we're trying to do. Get involved any way that you can. We're going to have some other information sessions set up. And we may have some open forum sessions as well, just to collect information about the survey and what you think might be able to be enhanced on that survey. Is it reasonable, really, to ask for data that's where the data is being stored and what application that they're using? Visit the data categorization website. That's a really great resource. We continue to update that on a regular basis. Become familiar with those 2 policies, 8071, 80G07, that list all the details of what you need to know within those 2 policies. And then prepare for inventory. Think about the data that you're currently storing. Start talking to others about the data that they're storing. It's interesting to know, initially you would think it's common sense to know about all the data that you're currently storing, but until you start really analyzing and thinking about all those applications that you use in those storage containers, you really might not know. And ask to get involved early. If you're interested in piloting, we'd be happy to hear from you. Just let us know, okay? Unit liaisons have not been assigned. We do expect they'll be assigned within the next month. And we do hope to post that information on our website. If it's not posted on the website, you can contact us and we'll let you know if there's one assigned to your unit. So going back a couple years ago, this is something that we had hoped to roll out about 6 years ago, maybe even back as far as 1993. We are now truly making this a reality. We're running with data categorization. This is something that will continue. We are expecting to roll this out to the entire university within the next 8 months or so. And then we'll move on to faculty probably afterwards. Here's a list of resources. Got the DataCat website and the policies that are available. Are there any questions or final thoughts?
I know this is going to be a long project, but how do you envision this applying to whenever we bring new systems into the university too? Will there be a process in place that they would have to go through when setting that up, or if you even thought about that yet?
We do expect that the unit liaison will be able to communicate that to the staff to let them know, hey, anytime you're pulling up a new system, they'll have to fill out a survey just as they would any other time. And I think some of this comes into vendor management as well. If you're using a vendor or third party to store your data, there may be a set of the minimum security baseline standards that we'll want them to follow as well. But we haven't worked out those details either. Thank you. Any questions online?
So the question is, what will you look for in a liaison?
You want to pass that off to Kathy? She'll be able to know.
Kathy's going to answer that for us.
It'll all be in the letter. Well, basically, it has to be a technical enough person to understand everything that we're asking for, but also somebody senior enough to have access to the dean or the leader of the unit when we're talking about the college level. If it goes lower than that, then it's going to be pretty much up to the unit to decide. But you know, there has to be at least a moderate level of technical understanding to do this, even with the training that we're going to give.
Okay. A number of years ago, all staff were asked to certify that they didn't have SSNs. Many staff, I reckon, signed a document blindly, perhaps out of ignorance, perhaps out of laziness. Do you see staff taking the same approach here?
I think they'll still be obligated to complete the survey, and it's up to them whether they want to answer honestly or not. And we'll have a record of how they answered. So I think it's going to be dependent on what their knowledge level is of what they're storing. And there may be times where people miss the particular data type that they're storing. It's very possible. And there's really no way around it, but this is our best approach and best attempt to gather that information.
And while the liaisons might not necessarily know exactly the data type, but you know, they might have some idea, and it's really where it's going to have to be a team effort, not only the people filling out the surveys, but also the liaisons who have some familiarity with the environment that they work in, to be able to you know, give some input if they feel like somebody isn't filling the survey out right. One of the things in Modulo is that the liaisons will have the opportunity to correct answers, talk with the the person where the survey doesn't have to go out again. If they go back and say, "Are you sure you're not storing this?" and they might say, "Oh yeah, you're right, I am," the liaison can change that answer. So they'll have that ability to do that within their unit. So we'll really be relying on the liaison to have that understanding of their environment to help their users get through this.
I have a couple questions. One of them is whether you can give us some idea of what the minimum security baseline involves. You know, what are sort of the characteristics of it? But the other question is, do you anticipate ever coming up with a situation where there's a kind of data that you haven't come across before, and you're not sure how to categorize it between, say, restricted and
Internal control.
Internal control, and how is the decision made? You know, who makes that decision? Which category it falls in?
I'll look to Kathy to answer his second question, or the first if she'd like.
That question would have to come back probably via security, but I don't think we would be the ultimate answer. When there's a governance structure, that governance structure would be talking back and forth to whoever received the data first, who should have probably the highest level say in what they think it should be.
Let me give you an example. Let's say that there's data that clearly shouldn't go outside Penn State. So it's at least at least internal control. But even within Penn State, only certain eyes should see the data. Does that make it restricted?
Not necessarily. That's again going to be a judgment call on how it should be categorized. And again, it gets down to, okay, how much damage if this really goes to someone other than for whom it was intended. If it's major damage to individuals or to the institution, then it's going to be restricted. If otherwise, it may just fall back to internal controlled.
And we are coming up with a matrix with respect to restricted data storage, whether it's permissible to store that on a third party or if you should keep it internally, and the controls that are around that. So that's something that will kind of be aligned with what we're doing with our initiative, something that we hope to develop within the next few months or so.
Right. And then your first question about the minimum security baseline, it'll really be a matrix set up for public data and what controls need to go for public data, like logging requirements, restricting administrative access.
Here's some of the different controls.
Yeah, things like that. And they'll actually be split between public and then internal control and restricted. And then they'll, as that approaches ITLC in August, there'll be more to come on that, hopefully shortly, right after that. I think we have a question. How does this affect personal devices that may have Penn State data? Kathy's going to take it.
It's all about the data. Your personal device, if it's holding that kind of data, needs that level of protection. So whoever owns that device is going to need to be talking to their IT staff, to whoever, to be sure they have that level of control. I think ultimately, eventually, there's going to be a lot more virtual storage, so people from their personal devices will be accessing via a remote access protocol, and it won't even be on their personal device. But that's future looking. But it is all about the data.
And that's really where when we think a lot about research data, that we know that there's a lot of grad students who have their own machines that might store this data. And that's actually one of the reasons we want to get a good grasp on administrative data, because that tends to have a little bit more control. A lot of users have, Penn State provided machines here, but when you think about on the research side, there's a lot of personal machines on that side. So that is something that we considered with pushing off towards the faculty. No more questions? Any questions in the room? Oh. This only deals with data storage and not access of data.
That's correct. We are only looking at capturing the information that you are storing for data categorization, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and that's one thing where I think the liaisons will have to help a lot of the end users, and we've actually saw it when our survey went from going from a technical audience to a non-technical audience, not understanding, accessing IBIS and ISIS or a network shared drive or something like that. So that's really where the liaison will come in and help them where they're actually getting that data.
When you get to the minimum security baseline, which is further on, it's a different phase. That's when you start getting into the access controls and things like that.
Anything else? I think we have one here.
What are your thoughts about storing data on Dropbox, Box, Google Docs, Carbonite? I mean, lots of people are doing all that and they think it's secure.
Right. We are going to come up with a matrix and an outline indicating what's permissible and what's not permissible to be stored in those devices. And we'll also address at some point pass space as well as some of the internal storage applications that we have available here. I don't, but I can do a general search if you want.
Okay. As they maybe pull up a site, we'll go into this other question that dealt with data storage versus access. It said the reason I ask is looking forward, services where there may be a cached local copy of something, how would the average user know about the cache? Yeah, you're right. The average user wouldn't know about the cache. We are exploring options for things like Box to be properly vetted, risk management-wise, security-wise, contract-wise, to be brought on site to Penn State. And yeah, something like that cache is something hopefully we can deal with administrative control machines, maybe the possibility of deleting that cache or something like that. But as Jen indicated, we are working on coming up with a matrix of where data can or should be stored.
Do you know where the
And we're actually bringing up a site in Michigan that we're modeling around how we store the data.
Look at data warehouse. Just click on data warehouse under IT tools and services. This tells you when you move down what you can and cannot store on the data warehouse. And go back. I'm not getting the green, yellow, red.
Yeah, that's what I was looking for, the stoplights.
Choose a data type over on the first thing. Attorney-client privilege, I don't know, it doesn't matter. You don't have to put that in there. You should be able to just go, and it'll tell you where you can store credit card data. There we go. So you'll get a red, green, or yellow, and whether you can store it.
Yeah, this is something that we're looking to put together from modeling after University of Michigan, where they have basically where you can store data.
Let's see, where's one? Just put FERPA data down. There you go. Get one that has a little bit more.
Okay. Way completely off.
You lose your connection?
I think so. Says I'm still connected, but can you still see it online? Yeah.
Well, we can get back to it. It's just, okay, there we go. Where's one that should give you more green?
Yeah, FERPA should do that.
FERPA should give you
Try it
more
again.
green.
Here we
There
go.
you go. So it'll give you a green, yellow, or red on what kind of apps, where you can store it, whether on, Box, which here it says not on the non-core. Does it have Box? Yeah, Box core apps, you can store it. Box non-core apps, you can't. So you can't store it on a personal account in Dropbox. So that's kind of what we're looking to do for Penn State.
Yeah, yeah, and our page would have things like passspace, maybe UCS briefcase, things like that, and hopefully be this easy to use as well, where you just drop down and select your type of data.
I'm absolutely confident you guys have talked about this, thought about this, but just because I wonder about it, I have to ask. It strikes me that in making the survey less onerous by asking them if they store this type of data and only then showing them examples of it, you're kind of setting yourself up for people who don't realize that a type of data they store falls under one of those categories, and therefore not selecting that they store it. Are you going to rely on the liaisons to do orientation prior to people in their units taking those surveys to inform them ahead of time what they're going to be up against? Or will you have to catch all of that in the aftermath? I mean, I realize you're trying to make it as non-onerous as possible, but I fear you may be causing people not to be exposed to the examples of the type of information that, in fact, they're storing.
And that's why we're encouraging them to review the 2 policies at hand and make sure that they're very familiar with those before they even move into the survey. Because it is only providing a few examples. It's not all inclusive. And like you said, it would be real easy to say no. They're not going to see that other subset of questions that are going to apply. Right, right. And that is one of the things that we piloted with DLT was the longer survey versus a shorter one versus this combined effect. And we felt that that would be the most successful way to move forward with this. But that possibility does exist. However, if we can continue with the awareness and making sure the unit liaisons know what their responsibility is, hopefully we can accomplish what we want to.
Yeah, and we're also, I know in the pilot, for one of the phases, they chose to sit down with the users and kind of go through the survey. Obviously, that might not be available if you have 1,000 users. You can't necessarily sit down with all of them. But through the orientation process, we're going to try to come up with some ways you can help that with maybe having open sessions where people want to attend, or you know, we're going to have lots of information up on our website as well. So really just offering as many ways possible to get this information out to them.
And, you know, in an effort I should just have a microphone. In an effort as complicated as this one, we know that it's not going to be easy. There's going to be back and forth between us and the unit liaisons and us and staff, and but it's an effort that we really need to do for all the reasons that we kind of explained up front, to locate the data and protect it in accordance with its sensitivity.
Okay. Any final thoughts?
Anything else?
All right. Well, thanks, everyone.